In this video, we are going to summarize the results of the paper we published in IEEE Journal of Photovoltaics titled Limiting Efficiency of Heterojunction Solar Cells. In case you later on want to go into more detail, you can download the paper from this address that contains the digital object identifier of the paper. The paper is open access, so if you want to download it, you shouldn't find any problem in doing so. So it's a discussion about the limiting efficiency of heterojunction solar cells. So it seems convenient to describe first what we consider as a heterojunction solar cell. We consider that an heterojunction solar cell is a solar cell made up of two different semiconductors with different gaps. One of them can be p-type, the other one n-type, or vice versa. This is not relevant for the discussion. And also, before entering into the discussion of its limiting efficiency, it's also convenient to review the details of the theory related to the calculation of the limiting efficiency of a single gap solar cell. This theory was established by Shockley and Quasar in 1961, and it's known as the detailed balance limit of a p-n junction solar cell. If you want to consult a review of this paper, in which you can find additional details, you can also go to the review I did together with my mentor, Professor Araujo, in 1994. Well, in this theory, we need to calculate the current voltage characteristic of the solar cell, and the current is calculated as the difference between the number of photons that are absorbed and the number of photons that are emitted, as the balance between both processes. The number of photons emitted is related to the voltage of the cell, the voltage at which the solar cell is operated, and this voltage is given by the difference between the electron quasi-Fermi level at one side and the hole quasi-Fermi level at the other side. It can be proven also that due to the existence of a stimulated emission, this voltage is limited by the gap of the solar cell. So, for example, if the gap is 1.1 electron volts, that means that the voltage cannot exceed 1.1 volt. For an additional aspect of the theory is that it is considered that carriers have infinite mobility. This is reasonable since we are interested in the calculation of the limiting efficiency. We have to assume zero ohmic losses. But one detail that will be relevant is that when we consider infinite carrier mobility, we are forced to draw the quasi-Fermi levels flat all along the structure. This is something we will use later in the theory of the limiting efficiency of the heterojunction solar cell. When still in the field of the limiting efficiency of the single gap solar cell, when we plot this limiting efficiency as a function of the band gap of the semiconductor, we find a maximum, which is 40.7% at maximum concentration. There is a maximum because when we go at high band gaps, the solar cell, the gap is transparent to photons coming from the sun. So the cell cannot achieve a high current and therefore cannot achieve a very high efficiency. At the other side, when the gap is low, the voltage is limited by the gap, as we have mentioned. So also, in this case, although the current can be high, the voltage is low. So at the end, there is an equilibrium in between, and the optimum gap is around 1.1 volts. So when we now work with a heterojunction solar cell, the question is whether the limiting efficiency is determined by the low gap semiconductor or the high gap semiconductor. So let's consider first the case in which we still consider that the mobility is infinite, because we still pursue to have not to have losses due to the resistance, to ohmic effects. So one situation we could consider is that in which the voltage is not higher than the voltage multiplied by the electron charge is not higher than the low bandgap semiconductor. In this case, the absorption of the total cell is given by the low bandgap semiconductor, because all the photons with an energy larger than the energy of the low bandgap semiconductor will be absorbed, but the voltage in this case will be low because it is not higher than the gap of the low bandgap semiconductor. We could think in removing this restriction by considering that it is possible to increase the separation between the quasi-Fermi levels and have a situation like this. In this case, the absorption will be still given by the low bandgap semiconductor, but this situation in which the quasi-Fermi level split is larger than the bandgap of the low bandgap semiconductor is forbidden, because it could lead to a stimulated emission and therefore to a degradation of the solar cell efficiency. So in this case, in which we consider that the mobility is infinite, we arrive to the conclusion that the limiting efficiency is determined by the low bandgap semiconductor. Now we could think in a case in which we remove the restriction of considering the mobility as infinite and consider a situation like this. In this case, the absorption would be still determined by the low bandgap semiconductor, and in this drawing we see that the voltage could be still high because it's given by the difference between the electron quasi-Fermi level at one side and the whole quasi-Fermi level at the other side. But here, although it seems that we can have the best of both worlds, high current and high voltage, now in this case, in this example, the whole quasi-Fermi level bends, which means that the mobility is finite. So this introduces losses, because this introduces some irreversibility in the process. And the question is how to take into account those losses. In the paper, you can find that this case can be modeled by a simplified circuit in which we have one solar cell that could be equivalent to a solar cell made of the high bandgap semiconductor that we are going to call top cell, and another cell which is determined by the low bandgap semiconductor that we are going to call bottom cell. And both cells are separated by an equivalent resistance that comes from this quasi-Fermi level that was not flat. Now we can have several cases as a result. For example, when this resistance goes to infinity, the bottom cell is disconnected from the main circuit, and what we have is nothing else than the top cell. So the efficiency will be the efficiency of the top cell. On the other side, when the resistance goes to zero, it can be proven that both circuits merge, and the equivalent circuit is again the resulting equivalent circuit is the one that corresponds to a cell made of the low gap semiconductor. We can see how the current voltage characteristics of the solar cells evolve also with the value of the resistance. For example, when the resistance is high, as we said, what we have is the solar cell made of the high gap semiconductor, and therefore we have a high voltage and a low current. As the resistance decreases, the fill factor modifies, the open circuit voltage reduces, and in the limit in which the resistance is zero, we have a solar cell which current voltage characteristics is given by the low gap semiconductor, and therefore it has a high current, but its voltage has been reduced. Another way of seeing this is like if we recover again the efficiency plot of the single gap solar cell versus the band gap. When the resistance was 0, we had the efficiency of the low bandgap semiconductor, of a solar cell made of the low bandgap semiconductor. When the resistance goes to infinity, we have the efficiency of a solar cell made of the high bandgap semiconductor. And in between, when the resistance is in between, we have an efficiency in between, in which never this efficiency exceeds the limiting efficiency of the single gap solar cell. Well, this work has been possible thanks to the funding of the European project Greco, the Spanish national project 2 Gaps, and the funding by the Comunidad de Madrid. Thank you.